The boy stood between two graves like a question mark carved into the earth. Thomas Crane didn't hear him at first. He was bent over the water trough, scrubbing rust from the rim with a wire brush, when the shadow fell across the wood, small, motionless. When he looked up, the sun was behind the boy's head, turning him into a silhouette against the wide Montana sky. "Sir." Thomas straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 thin as a fence post, with dirt on his knees and a hat too big for his head. His eyes were old, though, too old for a face that young. "What is it, son?" The boy swallowed. "I found something." Thomas set the brush down. "Where?" "Up on the ridge, past the fence line." The boy's voice cracked. "I found Papa's twin graves." The words hung there, strange and wrong, like a chord played out of tune. Thomas didn't move. "Your Papa's buried in town, at the church cemetery." "I know." The boy nodded, and his hat slipped forward. He pushed it back with a trembling hand. "But there's two more. Up there." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "What's your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Ashford." Ashford. The name hit Thomas like a fist. He knew it the way you know a scar you don't look at anymore. He glanced toward the ridge, where the pines stood black against the afternoon light, and then back at the boy. "Show me." They walked in silence, the boy leading, Thomas following a step behind. The land rose gradually, dry grass crunching under their boots. The wind moved through the trees ahead, low and steady, carrying the smell of pine and dust. Daniel didn't say much, just kept his eyes forward, hands stuffed in his pockets. Once, he looked back over his shoulder, as if to make sure Thomas was still there. "How'd you find them?" Thomas asked. "I was looking for strays. Mama sent me up to check the fence after the storm last week." Daniel paused. "I saw the stones through the trees. Thought maybe it was old graves. Settler graves, you know. And then I saw Papa's name." The ridge flattened into a clearing ringed by ponderosa pines. The ground here was softer, shadowed, untouched by cattle or plow. And there, beneath the reaching arms of an ancient tree, were two graves. Thomas stopped. They were crude hand-carved markers, weathered gray by years of rain and snow. But the letters were still legible, cut deep into the wood. Jacob Ashford, died August 14, 1891, and beside it, identical. Jacob Ashford, died August 14, 1891. Thomas felt his pulse in his throat. He stepped closer, crouching low, running his fingers over the carved letters. The wood was old, very old, maybe 15 years, maybe more. "Your father," Thomas said quietly. "When did he die?" 2 months ago, June." Daniel's voice was small. "But the date on these, that's when he was born." Thomas turned to look at the boy. "What?" "The 14th of August, 1891. That's Papa's birthday." Daniel's face was pale. "Mama told me. That's the day he came into the world." Thomas stood slowly, staring at the graves. His mind was turning over itself, trying to make sense of what didn't make sense. Two graves, same name, same date, but the date wasn't a death, it was a birth. "You ever hear your Papa talk about this place?" Thomas asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, sir. We only moved here 3 years ago. Bought the land from a man named, I don't remember. But Papa never came up this far. He always said the ridge was too rocky for cattle." Thomas looked around the clearing. It was isolated, hidden, the kind of place you'd have to know about to find. "Who owns this land now?" "You do, sir." Daniel's voice was almost a whisper. "This is your property. The fence line's a 1/4 mile back." Thomas felt the weight of that settle over him. He'd owned this ranch for 20 years. Bought it after the war, after everything fell apart. He knew every draw, every creek, every stand of trees. But this he'd never seen. Or maybe he had, once, a long time ago. He closed his eyes, and for just a moment, he was somewhere else, somewhere darker, a barn, Smoke. The sound of a man screaming. "Sir?" Thomas opened his eyes. Daniel was watching him, worried. "You all right?" "Yeah." Thomas cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'm fine." But he wasn't. Because now, standing in this clearing with the wind moving through the pines and the graves staring up at him like open eyes, Thomas remembered. He remembered the night Jacob Ashford died. The first time. "You should go home," Thomas said. Daniel didn't move. "What about the graves?" "I'll take care of it." "But—" "Go home, Daniel." Thomas's voice was firmer now, not unkind, but final. "Tell your mama I'll come by tomorrow. We'll talk then." The boy hesitated, then nodded. He took one last look at the graves, then turned and started back down the ridge, his too big hat bouncing with each step. Thomas waited until he was gone. Then he turned back to the graves and knelt down between them. "Jacob," he said softly. "What the hell did you do?" The wind answered, low and mournful, and somewhere in the back of Thomas's mind, a door he'd kept locked for 15 years began to creak open. Thomas didn't go home that night. He sat on the ridge until the sun dropped behind the mountains and the clearing turned gray, then black. The graves became shadows. The trees became shapes, and Thomas sat between them, his back against the old ponderosa, staring at nothing, remembering the 14th of August, 1891. It was hot that summer, the kind of heat that made men mean and cattle stupid. Thomas had been younger than 32, maybe 33, and still carrying the war in his bones. He'd bought the ranch cheap, from a widow who didn't want it anymore, and spent his days trying to forget what he'd seen in Tennessee. But forgetting was hard when you had neighbors. Jacob Ashford had shown up in late July, riding a mule with a pregnant wife behind him and not much else. He'd asked around town for work, and someone Thomas never found out who had sent him up to the ridge. "I can work," Jacob had said. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with hands like shovels. "I don't need much, just a place for my wife to rest. Baby's coming soon." Thomas had looked at the woman. She was pale, exhausted, holding her belly like it might fall. He'd nodded. "There's a cabin up past the tree line. Hasn't been used in years, but it's got a roof. You can stay there. Work the fence line, help with the branding." Jacob had smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Crane. You won't regret it." But Thomas did regret it, because 2 weeks later, on the night of August 14th, Jacob Ashford's wife went into labor, and something went terribly, impossibly wrong. Thomas stood now, his knees stiff from sitting. He walked a slow circle around the graves, his boots crunching on dry pine needles. He could still hear the screaming. It had started just after sundown. Thomas had been in the barn, checking a lame horse, when the sound cut through the night raw. Animal, desperate. He'd run, up the ridge, through the trees, toward the cabin. When he got there, the door was open. Jacob was inside, kneeling beside the bed, holding his wife's hand. Her face was white, slick with sweat. The midwife, a Crow woman from town, was shaking her head, speaking low in her own language. "She's dying," Jacob had said. His voice was flat, empty. "The baby's stuck. She's dying, and there's nothing. Get out." The midwife had snapped at Thomas. "This is no place for men." But Thomas hadn't moved, because, in that moment, he'd seen something in Jacob's eyes. Something dark. Something that looked like a decision being made. "Jacob," Thomas had said carefully, "whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking I'm not losing both of them." Jacob stood. His hands were shaking. "There's a way. There's always a way." "What are you talking about?" Jacob had turned to him then, and his face was different, older, colder. "You ever hear of the two-soul bargain?" Thomas had stared at him. "What? Old magic. Older than this country. Older than us." Jacob's voice was rising. "You give one life to save two. You split yourself. You—" "Jacob, you're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense," Jacob shouted. "I can give my life and still live. I can save her and the baby and still be here. I just have to." The midwife had grabbed his arm. "You don't know what you're saying." That magic, it's not real. And even if it were, it's cursed. I'd be alive, Jacob said, and so would they. He'd walked out of the cabin before anyone could stop him. Thomas had followed. Now, standing in the clearing, Thomas looked down at the graves again. He'd found Jacob an hour later, in this exact spot. Kneeling between two holes, he dug himself, a knife in his hand and blood on his shirt. "It's done," Jacob had whispered. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. "I gave them my name, my death, my birth. I gave it twice. Once for her, once for the baby." "Jacob, what did you do?" "I made a trade." Jacob smiled, but it was wrong, too wide, too empty. "I'm still here, Thomas, but I'm also gone. Do you understand?" Thomas hadn't understood. He still didn't. But when they'd gone back to the cabin, Jacob's wife was sitting up. The baby was crying. Both alive, both healthy, and Jacob had collapsed. "You died that night," Thomas said aloud to the graves. "I buried you myself. Right here. 2 graves. Because you said there were 2 of you now." He crouched down, touching the nearest marker. "But then you woke up." Jacob had opened his eyes the next morning, gasping, clawing at the dirt. Thomas had pulled him out, terrified, confused. Jacob had been weak, disoriented, but alive. "I'm still here," he'd whispered, "but part of me isn't. Part of me stayed." Thomas had helped him back to the cabin, told the midwife to keep quiet, told himself it was fever, shock, grief, but he'd never forgotten the graves. And he'd never told anyone. "Why didn't you tell your son?" Thomas asked the empty air. "Why did you let him find this?" The wind moved through the trees, but there was no answer. Thomas stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked down the ridge toward the lights of his ranch, then back at the graves. He had a choice to make. He could bury this again, fill in the graves, burn the markers, tell Daniel it was a mistake, let Jacob Ashford rest, wherever he was, or he could dig. Because if Jacob had split himself, if he'd given part of his life to save his family, then maybe, just maybe, that part was still here, still waiting. Thomas pulled his hat low and started walking toward the barn. He'd need a shovel. The first shovel strike rang out like a bell in the silence. Thomas worked slowly, methodically, the way he'd learned in the war. Dig, lift, toss, repeat. The earth here was softer than he'd expected, loose, as if it had been disturbed before, as if something beneath it had shifted over the years. The moon was high now, full and cold, turning the clearing silver. His shadow stretched long across the second grave, still untouched. He didn't know what he was looking for. A body, maybe, bones, some proof that Jacob Ashford had done what he'd said. Split himself, traded his life, walked away from his own death, or maybe he was just looking for peace. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something solid. Thomas froze. His breath came hard and fast, misting in the night air. He crouched, brushing dirt away with his hands, and his fingers found wood. A box, not a coffin. Too small, maybe 2 feet long, a foot wide. Rough pine, bound with rusted iron straps. He pried it loose from the earth, lifted it out, and set it on the ground beside the grave. For a long moment, he just stared at it. "What did you bury, Jacob?" He reached for the lid, and a voice behind him said, "I wouldn't do that." Thomas spun, his hand going instinctively to his hip, but he wasn't wearing a gun, hadn't worn one in years. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, lean, dressed in a long coat despite the summer heat. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a black hat, but his voice was familiar, too familiar. "Jacob," Thomas whispered. The man stepped forward, into the moonlight. It was him, and it wasn't. The face was Jacob Ashford's, same broad jaw, same deep-set eyes, but older, worn, and there was something wrong about the way he stood, the way he moved, like a puppet with one string cut. "Not quite," the man said. His voice was Jacob's, but hollow, echoed. "I'm what he left behind." Thomas's mouth went dry. You're dead. Am I? The man tilted his head, and the motion was too smooth, too slow. I've been standing here for 15 years, Thomas. Waiting. Watching. You think that's death? I buried you. You buried a name. A date. A promise. The man crouched beside the second grave, running his fingers over the marker. But you can't bury a split soul. It doesn't stay down. Thomas took a step back. What do you want? I want to be whole again. The man's eyes, Jacob's eyes, locked onto Thomas's. He took half of me to save them. His wife, his son. He walked away with my life, and I stayed here with my death. Do you know what that feels like? To be alive and dead at the same time. Jacob made his choice. Jacob made a mistake. The man stood, and his voice sharpened. He thought he could cheat it, thought he could have both. But the magic doesn't work that way. You can't split a soul and expect both halves to survive. Thomas's hand tightened around the shovel. What happens if you become whole again? The man smiled. It was a terrible smile. One of us stops existing. That, and the boy, Daniel, he'll lose his father. The man shrugged. He already did. 2 months ago. When Jacob died, I felt it. The tether broke. Now I'm the only one left. The only real Jacob Ashford. You're not real. You're a ghost. I'm more real than he ever was. The man's voice rose, angry now. I'm the part that stayed, the part that suffered, the part that kept the bargain. Thomas felt the weight of the shovel in his hands. He could swing it. End this. Whatever this was. But something stopped him. If you're the real Jacob, Thomas said slowly, then why didn't you go to your family? Why stay here? The man's face twisted. Because I can't leave. The graves hold me. The names hold me. I'm bound to this place until what? Until someone opens the box. Thomas looked down at the small wooden box at his feet. What's inside? What? His heart. The man's voice dropped to a whisper, the half he didn't take with him. Open it, and I'll be free. I can go to them. I can be the father Daniel needs. And Jacob, the real Jacob, he's gone, Thomas. He's been gone for 2 months. You'd just be giving me what was always mine. Thomas stared at the box. His hands were shaking. Behind him, the wind picked up, and he heard it faint, distant, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. The man heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time, Thomas saw fear in his eyes. Who's coming? Thomas asked. Someone who knows what I am. The man backed toward the tree line. Someone who'll stop me. Who? The man looked at Thomas one last time. His wife, and then he was gone, slipping into the shadows like smoke. Thomas turned toward the sound of hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the ridge, fast, the horse's breath loud in the night. He grabbed the shovel, ready, and then a woman emerged from the trees. She was older, maybe 50, with gray streaks in her dark hair. She wore a simple dress, a shawl around her shoulders, and her eyes were hard as stone. Mr. Crane, she said, dismounting. Step away from the box. Thomas didn't move. Mrs. Ashford, step away. Your son came to me. He found the graves. I know. Her voice was sharp. I sent him. Thomas stared at her. What? I needed you to dig. She walked forward, her boots crunching on pine needles. I needed someone to open the grave, to bring him out. Why? She stopped in front of the box, looking down at it with something like sorrow. Because I'm the one who buried it, she said quietly, and I'm the one who has to destroy it. She pulled a match from her pocket, and Thomas realized, with cold, creeping certainty, that he'd just made everything worse. Don't, Thomas said. Margaret Ashford didn't look at him. She held the match between her fingers, unlit, staring down at the wooden box like it was a coffin she'd opened too soon. You don't understand what's in there, she said. Then tell me. She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the clearing, stirring the dry grass around the graves. Finally, she spoke. The night Jacob saved us, saved me and Daniel, he didn't just give his life, he gave his future. Her voice cracked. Every year he would have lived, every moment he would have had with us. He put it all in that box and buried it here. Thomas felt his chest tighten, because the magic required a trade, not just death, a sacrifice. He had to give up the life he wanted most, the one with us, to make sure we survived. She knelt beside the box, her hand hovering over the lid, and the thing he left behind, the shadow of him. It's been waiting here ever since, trying to take that life back. I saw him, Thomas said, just now. He looked like Jacob. He's not Jacob. Margaret's voice was firm. He's everything Jacob was too afraid to be. The anger, the selfishness, the hunger. Jacob split himself to save us, but he didn't realize what he was leaving behind. Thomas crouched beside her. What happens if we destroy it? Then Jacob's sacrifice is complete. The shadow disappears, and whatever's left of my husband's soul can finally rest. She looked at Thomas, and her eyes were wet, but it also means Daniel will never know the truth. He'll think his father was just a man who died too soon. He won't know what Jacob gave up for him. Maybe that's better. Maybe. She looked away. Or maybe he deserves to know that his father loved him enough to die twice. Thomas sat back on his heels, looking at the two graves. You knew about this all this time, I suspected. Margaret's voice was soft now, almost tender. Jacob was never the same after that night. He'd wake up screaming. He'd stare at nothing for hours. He told me once, near the end, that he felt like half of him was missing, like he was living someone else's life. Why didn't you come here sooner? I was afraid. She smiled, sad and small, afraid of what I'd find, afraid that if I opened the box, the shadow would take him from me all over again. She paused. But 2 months ago, when Jacob died in his sleep, I felt something break, like a chain snapping. I knew the shadow was free, and I knew it would come for Daniel. Why Daniel? Because Daniel is Jacob's future, the one he gave up. Margaret's hand trembled. The shadow doesn't want to be whole. It wants to replace Jacob, to live the life he couldn't. And if it does, Daniel loses his father, Thomas finished. Again, Margaret nodded. They sat in silence for a while, the two of them beside the open grave, the box between them like a dark secret. Finally, Thomas spoke. Did you love him? Margaret looked at him surprised. Jacob? Yeah. She smiled, and this time it was real. Every day, even when he was broken, even when he was afraid. She touched the edge of the box gently, as if it might hurt her. He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn and proud, and he made terrible decisions. But he loved us more than he loved himself. And that's rare, Mr. Crane. That's worth remembering. Thomas thought of the man he'd seen in the clearing, the shadow, the hollow voice, the empty eyes. He told me he wanted to be whole again, Thomas said. The shadow. He said if I opened the box, he'd be free. He lied. Margaret's voice hardened. If you open that box, he'll take what's inside and use it to become real. He'll walk down that ridge, knock on my door, and Daniel will see his father's face. But it won't be Jacob. It'll be a ghost wearing his skin. Then we burn it. If we burn it, Jacob's sacrifice means nothing. The magic unravels. The bargain breaks. She looked at Thomas, her eyes desperate. And I don't know what happens to Daniel if that's true. The magic saved him. If we destroy it. Thomas's blood went cold. You think it could kill him? I don't know. Her voice broke. I don't know, and that's what terrifies me. Thomas stood, pacing the clearing. His mind was turning over itself, trying to find a way out. But every path led to the same place. Someone had to lose. Either Daniel lost his father's memory, or he lost his life. There has to be another way. Thomas said, if there is. Jacob didn't find it. Thomas stopped. He turned to look at Margaret, and an idea, wild, impossible, began to form in his mind. What if we don't destroy it? He said slowly. What if we bury it again? Deeper. Somewhere the shadow can't reach. Margaret frowned. It's been 15 years. He's already here. Burying it won't stop him. No, but it might trap him. Thomas knelt beside the box, his hands hovering over the iron straps. If this box holds Jacob's future, the life he gave up, then maybe it's also a cage. Maybe as long as it stays buried, the shadow stays bound to this place. And if someone else digs it up, then we make sure no one does. Thomas looked at her. We fill the graves. We burn the markers. We plant trees over the whole damn clearing if we have to. But we don't open it, and we don't destroy it. Margaret was quiet. Then, slowly, she nodded. It's not perfect, she said. No, Thomas agreed. But it's a chance. She stood, brushing dirt from her dress. And Daniel, 9, Adoi, 9. You tell him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Thomas picked up the box, feeling its weight in his hands. You tell him his father loved him, and that love doesn't end when the grave does. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, touching the box one last time. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas nodded, and together they lowered the box back into the earth. They worked through the night. Thomas filled the first grave while Margaret gathered stones from the creek below. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, the clearing looked almost untouched, just a patch of turned earth beneath the old ponderosa, covered now with river rock and deadfall. The wooden markers lay in pieces, snapped and piled for kindling. Margaret stood back, wiping her hands on her dress. Her face was exhausted, lined with dirt and grief. But there was something else there, too. Relief, maybe, or resolution. It's done, she said. Thomas nodded. He drove the shovel into the ground and leaned on it, catching his breath. The sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting the pines gold and red. What will you tell Daniel? He asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the truth, that his father was a good man who made an impossible choice, that he gave everything to keep us safe, and that some sacrifices don't have monuments, they have silence. He'll want to see the graves again. I know. She looked at the disturbed earth, the stones, the broken markers. But by the time he comes back up here, this will just be another part of the ridge. Trees will grow, grass will cover it, and maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be remembered, just honored. Thomas thought about that, about the graves he'd dug in Tennessee, the men he'd buried without names, the wars that ended quietly, in unmarked fields, forgotten by everyone except the ones who survived. Yeah, he said. Maybe. They walked down the ridge together as the sun climbed higher. The land woke around them, birds calling, cattle lowing in the distance, the dry grass shimmering with dew. At the bottom, where the fence line began, Margaret stopped. She looked back up toward the clearing, hidden now behind the trees. Do you think he's still there? She asked. The shadow? Thomas followed her gaze. I don't know, but if he is, he's not going anywhere. And if someone else finds it, years from now, then they'll have the same choice we did. Thomas adjusted his hat. And maybe they'll make the right one. Margaret smiled faintly. You're more optimistic than you look, Mr. Crane. I've lived long enough to know that hope's the only thing that outlasts grief. She nodded, and for a moment they stood there together, two people bound by a secret they'd never speak aloud. Thank you, Margaret said again, for not opening it, for trusting me. Thank your husband, Thomas replied. He's the one who loved you enough to stay dead. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just turned and started walking toward the road, where her horse waited. Thomas watched her go. Then he turned and headed back to the barn. He had work to do. 3 days later, Daniel came by the ranch. He was alone this time, riding a spotted mare, his too big hat still crooked on his head. He dismounted slowly, nervously, and walked up to where Thomas was mending a gate. Mr. Crane, Thomas looked up. Daniel, Mama told me. The boy's voice was small, About Papa. About what he did. Thomas set down his hammer. What did she tell you? That he saved us. That he gave up his life so we could live. Daniel swallowed hard. And that the graves, they weren't really graves. They were markers for what he left behind. Thomas nodded. That's true. She said you helped. That you buried it again. I did. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think he's at peace? Papa? Thomas looked at the boy, this thin, serious child who'd stumbled onto something far bigger than he could understand, and he chose his words carefully. I think your father made a choice that most men couldn't make, and I think that choice cost him everything. But I also think he'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant you and your mother were safe. Thomas paused. So yeah, Daniel, I think he's at peace, because he knows you're here. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He wiped them quickly, embarrassed, but Thomas pretended not to notice. Thank you, sir, Daniel whispered. Thomas reached out and squeezed the boy's shoulder. You're a good kid. Your father would be proud. Daniel nodded, sniffing. Then he climbed back onto his mare and rode away, back toward town, back toward his mother and whatever life they'd build without Jacob Ashford. Thomas watched him go until he was just a speck on the horizon. Then he turned back to the gate and kept working. Years later, the ridge changed slowly. Grass grew over the turned earth. Saplings took root among the stones. The old ponderosa stood watch, gnarled and silent, as seasons turned and the land forgot. Thomas Crane sold the ranch when he got too old to run it, moved into town, spent his last years in a rocking chair on the porch of the boarding house, watching the world move past. He never went back to the clearing, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blew just right, he thought he heard a voice on the ridge, calling out across the years, not angry, not sad, just waiting. Daniel Ashford grew up strong, took over his mother's land, married a school teacher, had 3 children of his own. He never spoke about the graves, but once, when his eldest son asked about his grandfather, Daniel took him up to the ridge. They stood beneath the old ponderosa, and Daniel pointed to the ground. This is where he's buried, Daniel said. Not in town. Here, where he wanted to be. His son looked around. I don't see a marker. You're not supposed to. Daniel smiled. Some men don't need markers. They live on in other ways. And that was enough. The final shot. The sun sets over the Montana ridge. The pines stand black against the fading light. The clearing is silent now, overgrown, unmarked, but beneath the earth, beneath the stones and roots and years, the box remains, waiting, not for someone to open it, but for someone to remember that some loves are so powerful, they split the soul, and some sacrifices are so great, they echo forever, even in silence.